Right, hello CMT1. This is my first Max video, so I'm going to introduce you today to MSP. So far we've only looked at Max, which has really dealt with the data side of the program. So for example, we've been looking at messages and objects like these, and we've kind of been making patches and dealing with patches that connect these together. So if I trigger this message here, it's going to send the value into the number object. So you should all by now be familiar with this kind of system. So this is all, hopefully, as you can see, dealing with data, and this is kind of control data, so numbers and messages and triggers and things like that. MSP, however, marks the start of where we're looking at signal processing going on in the program. So this is dealing directly with audio. So this is dealing directly with audio signal. So the first thing we're going to do here is just to introduce the difference really between the objects and how they look. So you can see here, this is my little bit of Max data working in this part of the patch. If, however, I bring in some MSP objects, such as these, then you'll see that they look a little bit different. And the main thing to look out for here is the connections. So when you are dealing with audio, i.e. when you're dealing with MSP objects, you get these kind of stripy yellow and black patch cables rather than the grey patch cables that you're dealing with your Max objects. So straight away you can look at this, even if you don't know what these objects are, and you know that these are MSP objects. And you can look at these and you know that these are kind of Max objects. So this is basically representing a different type of data or a different type of signal that's passing between the objects. So what this actually means is that, for example, with this part of our patch, this message of, let's change this, but this message of 56 will only get passed through from this number object to, from the message object to the number object. It will only get passed through when I click on this button. When I click on this button, a bang will be sent from the button to the message object. That will trigger the value that's held within the message, i.e. 56. That will be sent out to the number object. So it's going to go through in that order, and it's only going to occur when I click on the button. However, with MSP, when MSP is enabled, i.e. when it's turned on, then it is essentially generating and dealing with your audio data or your signal, the signal data at the sample rate. So, for example, assuming we're using 44.1 or 48 kilohertz as a sampling rate, that means that it's going to be sampling audio at 44,100 or 48,000 times every single second, and it will be doing that continuously. So that's really the difference between how the two different data types work, or the two different signal types work. So with your MSP, it's constantly updating, so any changes within the patch are going to be instantaneous, whereas with your Max, with the data side over here, this is only going to be going as fast as your system is generating those messages, or when you as the user are interacting with those messages. So as you would imagine, because we're dealing with kind of a very, very fast sampling rate over here, this place is more, it's more CPU intensive, so it's going to place more strain on your system. So you'll notice that your CPU usage will increase when you're working with MSP. So that's the basic introduction. So just to review, the MSP objects work differently to the Max objects. They also look differently. We know what an MSP object is by the colour of its cable that connects, or that comes out of it, compared with the grey cable here. And they work differently in terms of how fast and how their audio, in this case, or other data is generated and dealt with within the system. One final thing to mention on this kind of introduction is that these objects are not mutually exclusive. So we're not saying that you can only use MSP objects together and Max objects can only be used together, because, for example, if I create a toggle and send the toggle into this first MSP object, which is, as you can tell from the microphone, or guess from the microphone icon, it's an object that turns audio input on and off. So if I lock the patch, then I can actually use toggle to turn the audio input on and off. So using MSP, it's not a case of we're using it exclusively and all on its own in isolation. The idea here really is that we're bringing all the stuff that you've been doing in Max already together to control the MSP objects. Yeah. So one simple example of this is in the generation or in the use of an oscillator. So I'm going to introduce you here in demonstrating this to the cycle object, which is a sine wave oscillator. So the cycle object will generate a sine wave at a given frequency. How does it know what frequency to use? Well, if you haven't guessed already, we need to give it a frequency. So you can either do this as an argument. So if I put in 1000, that's going to tell the cycle object to oscillate at 1000 times per second, i.e. to generate a frequency of 1000. And then, as with the kind of metronome example that we've used before, we can then add a control using a Max object, i.e. dealing with Max data, hence the grey line here, the grey patch cable, and then we can override and update and change the frequency at which the cycle object is oscillating. So this is a nice example of how we can integrate an MSP object here, which you can see by the yellow and black patch cable, and a Max object. So we use the Max object to tell the MSP object what to do. So this all integrates together. So all the stuff you've done up to this point integrates with the MSP objects.